And welcome to Presence. I am Doug King, and I'm so glad to have you with us on this episode 2 of our series on cartography, the cartography of Christianity and the church. And in this series, we are mapping the evolution of Christianity and the church from past to present. And then we're going to propose a new map of the future of Christology. Today, what I want to do is look at the past that has led to the world religion known as Christianity and the institution known as the church. And when I talk about the past, I'm not just going to talk about going back 2,000 years to the teachings of Jesus and the apostolic writers. The history of Christianity doesn't begin there at all. The history of Christianity goes all the way back in the narrative, in the story, to Adam. Adam represents the genesis, or the in the beginning, if you will, of the story that we're proposing is about the evolution of spiritual consciousness with regard to universal God identity. And the emphasis in this series will be on universal God identity. And that evolutionary story begins in the genesis of it all. And there we will find Adam. And we'll also find Abraham. We're going to talk about him momentarily. But as I go through the series, when we get out to Christianity and the church, we're going to look at the 2,000-year-old history that's brought us to this point in time with regard to identity. And we'll look at the State of the Union, and we'll look at why and question why there's so much division when in fact the story begins with promises of unity. So we're going to look at that. And those of you who have been with me in Presence for quite some time now, you know that I have made great use of the model of spiral dynamics. And I'm going to pull that model up now so we can take a look at it and how I've got it laid out here in this particular slide. And I'm going to use spiral dynamics as I have in many past episodes. And I want to remind everyone that you may be a follower of Presence who's seen a lot of my presentations involving the spiral. That's good. That's fine. But I'm going to take some perspectives here that you may not have heard, and I'm going to take some of the elements of it and attempt to develop some greater depth to it as we again interpret the biblical narrative. But there are a number of you who may be watching this on YouTube who are coming to us from other places, other people recommending that you take a look at our site and some of our YouTubes. And I welcome you to this conversation. And you may be new to my use of spiral dynamics, the model. Spiral dynamics is not a religious model. It is a model that simply looks at the history of worldviews and their evolution. It is a model that is tied to the different values that emerge from each worldview. You will see on the chart here that it is color coded. And the beige, purple, red, as we go up the spiral, will be indicative of the values that emerge from each worldview in history, the values that are the focus. I will use the term values of ultimate concern. I kind of grabbed that from the theologian Paul Tillich, who used the term matters of ultimate concern. Here, each worldview level will have values of ultimate concern. So, anytime you're reading about spiral dynamics, you may see the term V meme, V as in value, V meme. And each worldview has a profile, a V meme that is associated with it. We'll see that as we go along. So, worldviews evolved according to values of ultimate concern. If we look at all the way back to the archaic worldview, what was the value that was the focus of that worldview? It was survival. That was the primary value. Now, that value included protection from predators, life threatening conditions related to things like drought or famine or floods, anything that threatened the very survival of the human is where worldviews began. And it began in what is called the archaic worldview phase. And you will see on the spiral, whenever you encounter it, that this worldview is beige. So we know that all of us have that beige worldview within us, and that whenever we are threatened, whenever our very survival is threatened, we will regress back from wherever it is we exist currently into the survival mode. All else will be put aside. Now, how do we make application? Let's begin with the biblical narrative. And okay, this is a spiral model, it is not religious. There are consultants in the field of business who use this model, in the fields of finance and economics, and in various other fields. So what I'm doing is I'm testing this model and actually now proposing this model to be a valid way to understand not just how the biblical narrative evolved, but here's the real point to all this. This model is being used to show how the interpretation of the biblical model evolved. I don't care who you are or what Christian denomination you're in today, you know that the iteration of biblical interpretation that you understand is a product of interpretations that have come before. I'm going to say most of you who are watching this video series are in a more progressive worldview, and that has led you to a more progressive church, if you will. That is primarily who our audience is, because once you get to that point, the question then begins, what is the future? Because we're sitting here in a progressive church, but we see all kinds of denominational division around us. And you probably, not necessarily, but you probably started in a more fundamental church, which would have been in the traditional worldview. So, what I'm getting at is the interpretation of God identity started with Adam. I'm going to go through that. And we're going to see that as we go through this series and what we look at on the focus of the narrative, that every emerging worldview has a emphasis on God identity, but an interpretation that evolves with it. So, starts with Adam. Adam saw God identity. How? Adam saw God identity as a thing to be grasped, and we're all familiar, even if you're not a Bible student, we're all familiar with the story of Adam and Eve and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in that garden, and that they were not to, in essence, grasp the fruit of it. That was the command. The story does also tell us that Adam desired to be like God. The adversarial voice in his head The reptilian stem that we all have that relates to our instinctive self was telling Adam, basically, in his thinking, look, if you want to survive, why be dependent upon God? Why not just take the fruit and be like God? So he wanted God identity and he thought he could grasp it by grasping the fruit. The survival instinct that we have doesn't want to depend on anyone or anything else for its survival. It's about me, it's about how I react, what I do. We're not thinking about anyone else, we're thinking about ourselves, our instinctual self. Now, Adam's archaic instinctual self wanted to have God identity, which is to say, Adam wanted the power related to God for himself. And in that sense, you don't have to depend on God. You are in that way like God. Adam's consciousness was coming, therefore, from the instinctual self as source. The source of his action was the instinctual self, the self as source. Now, I will say this, that when we get forward into the teachings of Jesus and the apostolic writers, the story is going to be a lot more specific as to the problems and dysfunctions that develop from the instinctual self versus the inward, God breathed spirit as source. And we will look specifically at the two ways that human beings can make a decision with regard to God identity. First, you can make a decision based on the instinctual self as source, or you can make a decision based on spirit as source. We'll clarify this as we go along. If this doesn't sound quite clear now, we're setting the stage for this because remember, in order to understand where things are right now with all the churches, all the denominations, everything in this world religion called Christianity, we have to start with the sources of the story from which the interpretation of Christianity and the church eventually came. So, in the beginning, Adam what? Adam takes the fruit, and the story then introduces some of the foundational principles that are going to lead us into this story uh, that develops into what we have today. So, if we look ahead to Paul, we know that Paul is going to teach that sin entered the world through Adam. Well, there right away, what do we have? Paul is teaching in his ministry that the roots of first century decisions about God identity started with the beginning of the story and Adam. And more than that, Paul will actually say that Jesus is the last Adam. So we know that Adam is where we should begin because Jesus represents the last Adam. And Paul is teaching about sin entering into the world through Adam. Therefore, that is what the impact is with regard to God identity. So, how did sin come about? What allowed sin to enter the world? The first response that someone might offer is that sin entered the world because Adam disobeyed. Pretty simple. But Adam could not disobey had there not been a commandment. God said, "Thou shalt not, thou shalt not eat." Sin and commandments go hand in hand. You can't miss the mark. That's sin, hamartia, meaning to miss the mark. You cannot sin. You cannot miss the mark unless there is a mark to miss. The commandment represents the mark. Thou shalt not eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Now a mark has been placed. You will either keep the commandment or violate the mark, which is to say, sin. This introduces boundary driven thinking. That's a term I use all the time. I'll continue to use it. Again, for those of you who have heard some of these things before, please stick with me because remember, we have people that are new to this and are constantly joining the presence following. And I want to make sure that we set this groundwork. And also, this hopefully will refresh your memory about how this can be explained as you talk to other people. So, this introduces the idea of boundary driven thinking with regard to God identity, and God identity is the focus of the story. These principles are behind the map we have today. And again, I want to emphasize their roots precede Christianity. We need to find out how we got here in order to know how we can go forward. And more importantly, we all know the phrase those that don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I'm going to propose that Christianity, because of the way it was interpreted from its very beginning, was doomed to repeat the same principles that led up to Christianity rather than transcend them. And that because that has happened, they have brought us, those principles have brought us 2,000 years of Christianity, world religion, and concepts of an institution called the church that have now finally reached their breaking point and can take us no further. And that we must now look to reinterpreting the story, not the way it has been reinterpreted for 2,000 years, but rather looking to models like spiral dynamics, integral theory, integral consciousness to see that the next thing that should be coming is an integrated, integral, and unified approach that completely changes the story and will take us in a whole new direction as we go along. That's going to be it is uncomfortable for people. I know I've been proposing this for a long time, and I know that it is, in fact, very uncomfortable. But so is the chaos that we see now for most of us within this world religion. If you don't see it and you're very happy where you are right now, but you still want to view the series, you are welcome. I'm not here to criticize where you are. I'm offering where we see it going and where the followers of presence have been heading for quite some time now. So let's get back to the story, the archaic level. What happens? Adam and Eve, by the way, I'm going to get to Eve in a minute because she was integral to the God identity story, just as Adam was. Adam and Eve were exiled. That's one of those key words in the story is exile. Why? Exile is separation. And in the biblical narrative, separation is death. That is why when we look at the genesis of the story, what does God say to Adam and Eve? The day you eat of the tree, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. In the biblical narrative, death is separation from God. It is a loss of relationship in terms of their God identity. It is not that God was saying, you're going to die biologically when you eat the fruit in the day that you eat the fruit, but rather that sin and death, meaning you're missing the mark, is immediately associated with and integrated with the loss of relationship and therefore a death, meaning a separation from the reality of your God identity. And the evolutionary journey of this biblical narrative is going to take us all the way to Jesus and the apostolic writers, and they will emphasize the role and function of Christology with regard to the restoration and reconciliation of all things all humans. That is why we have to start with the cause. Yes, sin and death were symptoms that were out there loud and clear when Jesus and the apostles came onto the scene, but what is the cause of those things? Commandments, for example, from the beginning with Adam, put boundary driven thinking into place. Sin is a violation of the boundaries. Later, we see explicitly taught the wages of sin is death. Those two go together. You can't separate them. Adam began the commandment process. And if we fast forward to Paul, Paul will even note that when the law was given, sin increased. Again, you would think, what? You issue the law. Why? So people will do the things they're supposed to do. But in essence, the human being doesn't do the things they're supposed to do from time to time, or in many occasions, or some occasions. And so when you add laws and when you add commandments, you add the potential for violation of those commandments and therefore the potential for missing the mark and the increase of sin and the solidification, if you will, of death within a system of law that does not provide universal God identity. So, archaic Adam used in the narrative set the stage for one seamless story about God identity. Who has God identity? Who does not? How does one get God identity? That's what we've set the stage for. So let's think about people that are in the field of construction, just as another example of why this is so critical from the start here. If you're in construction, you know what happens if the foundation of a building is off, even an inch, even less than an inch. What happens? As the building rises, which is to say, as the structure of God identity evolves, because that's what we're talking about in this story, this biblical story or narrative. As that structure of God identity evolves, eventually cracks will form. When enough time passes and the structure grows larger and larger, it will eventually collapse. We're saying that today, Christianity is an institutional structure full of cracks, separation, and denomination. It's undeniable. We all know that is the state of Christianity today. Its message of God identity is more fractured than ever. And the foundation of our map, the one that we're looking at for today's State of the Union, if you will, can be traced to the genesis of that story. So now we are going to move on and take a look at the second worldview, which is the tribal worldview. Survival was the value of the archaic worldview that people focused on. Survival was the value of ultimate concern. In the tribal era, we have the value of the magical, if you will. People were loyal to the elders of the tribe, so you have loyalty in there on a tribal level. And you follow the constraints of the customs and traditions of that tribe. You fell in line with that. And when it came to the spiritual side of it, then that is where the human understanding in the earliest days of humanity would equate to the concept of that which was magic or magical. So, for example, you would have magic like volcano gods or ocean gods, maybe sun worshippers, etc., etc. If we take this tribal magic view out to today and look for an example, today that worldview would be seen in those who practice voodoo. Voodoo would be related to this magic concept of spirituality. This is also why you see an emphasis on idolatry early in the narrative. Oh, the warnings were all over the place. You shall not have any idols before me. And when you read the biblical narrative at the beginning, all the nations practiced idolatry, and Israel was warned not to go back into idolatry. That's why there was such an emphasis on it. It's why Israel made a golden calf when Moses went up to receive the commandments. She had just come out of Israel. The golden calf was something that she was very familiar with. And you can sit in Sunday school, as I did, many people do, as kids. You could say, my goodness, God led Israel through the Red Sea, parted the Red Sea, delivered Israel from Pharaoh, did all of these amazing miraculous things. And the minute that Moses is not around, they make a golden calf. How is that possible? Well, it's because that's their worldview. That's how they understood it. Hey, to believe that there is one God and to not associate that God with an idol or some magical object that they could grasp would have been to them a very foreign way of thinking. Now, the other thing about the tribal age is that this worldview begins the collective. When we look at the archaic worldview, archaic Adam, that focuses on the individual. I'm focused on the value of my survival. When we get to the tribal, we have introduced values that are going to be associated and focused more on the collective. So the first two worldviews set the trajectory of movement from an emphasis on the individual and an emphasis on the collective. So, quickly looking at the chart, let's just take a look at this. We'll see this is what's going to unfold as we go along. The archaic level worldview is an emphasis on the individual. The tribal is an emphasis on the values of a collective. The warrior is an emphasis on individual values. The traditional moves back to values associated with a collective. The modern worldview is one that focuses on the rights of the individual, like in inalienable rights, et cetera, that appeared here in our history of modernity. And then when you move to postmodern, you move back to that which applies to collectives. So that movement, individual, collective is all the way through our history. Again, not as a religious model, just as a model of the way worldviews work. But when you apply this to the biblical narrative, you're going to see that it reflects exactly the way the biblical narrative is told. So I find that to be very fascinating, and that's why I use the spiral model, because it aligns with the biblical narrative and it helps to clarify the interpretations of the biblical narrative that have occurred through history and that have brought us to this point where I believe we're ready to make an evolutionary leap into, again, an integrated, unified, holistic, WHOL, holistic viewpoint, far from the place that we've been led today. So we'll see if this makes sense to you as we go along. And again, I'm going to depend on the text. I'm going to rely on the text, and I'll continue to go back to the text. Now, I said I would talk about Eve, and let's look at another perspective in the story. Another perspective of the story relates to the masculine and feminine. In the biblical narrative, the divine masculine relates more towards the individual, and the divine feminine more toward the collective, just as we have seen the movement from individual to collective, what do we note? Well, we note that my understanding of myself, is not just from an individual perspective, but also no man is an island. What does that mean? It means that we also gain an understanding of ourselves through collectives and our association in collectives and of collectives. So we are both individuals and we are both tribal, meaning we are both defined by collectives as well. In this sense, the collectives that we'll talk about will eventually wind up being the church. Initially, those collectives will revolve around Israel, but the complexity of evolution will expand from ethnocentric to more world centric understandings. And we'll see that evolution as we proceed in the interpretation of the biblical narrative. So, this is how our map gets shaped. And let me say a few things in closing in this episode as we set the stage here for the evolutionary story based on worldviews, that going out to Paul's teaching in Galatians 4, I have used this go to, if you will, for a great example of how Paul views God identity. And Paul emphasizes in Galatians 4 the very thing I said at the beginning, that there's two ways to attempt God identity. One is through self as source, and that'll be represented by Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael. Then there's also spirit as source. That will be represented by Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac. And those are your two God identities. One comes through self as source. That attempt, that's where Adam started. He tried through self as source to be like God. Then there's also spirit as source. Now, when you're talking about spirit as source, that which is born after spirit, Paul not only identifies that as Isaac, but Paul identifies that as the movement from the Jerusalem that was on the self as source, a city made by human beings, a city that was geographical, etc., to a new Jerusalem that represented something, ideas, consciousness that transcended the limitations of the boundaries of the first Jerusalem. And here's the only point I'll make as we kind of set up or set the stage for our next episode here. When Paul is talking about the New Jerusalem, he makes this statement about the divine feminine. He says, she, the New Jerusalem, she is the mother of us all. Here is Paul describing the divine feminine from a collective standpoint, because the collective is everything that belongs to the New Jerusalem. And what belongs to the New Jerusalem? All nations walk in the light of the New Jerusalem. This is the ultimate collective we're going to get to. So I'm doing a few spoiler alerts here, mainly because I don't want you to just sit here and listen and go, what's all this stuff in the Old Testament have to do with Christianity? Well, Jesus and the apostles say it has everything to do with what happened when they left the scene and the worldview that was present at that time, the foundational elements that were brought forward into the interpretation of Christology. So Christology ended up being interpreted as nothing more than yet another world religion with its own institution and its own specific identity that was not universal and unified, but as we have seen now today, has led us to where we are today. So I'm going to talk about this idea as I pick it up this next time. So I like to keep these podcasts in around 30, 35 minutes. And so I will pick it up here, and then we'll continue to move on through the history of Israel. I'm not going to take too much longer on it, and then really get into the meat of where we are today, especially for all of us who are or have been a part of uh, Christianity and the world religion thereof. So I will leave it here for today. I thank you for joining, and I look forward to seeing you the next time.